The CNN studio lights blazed hot as Mark Levin's voice echoed through the building, his signature New York accent cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, pointing directly at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett across the debate table. The 70-year-old conservative radio legend's face was red with fury, his hands trembling as he gripped his notes. But what happened next shocked everyone in the room. Crockett, the 43-year-old Texas Democrat, who had been taking Levin's verbal assault for the past 10 minutes, slowly reached into her briefcase. The camera zoomed in as she pulled out a familiar red, white, and blue book cover. Levin's eyes widened in horror as he recognized his own work staring back at him. "Mr. Levin," she said with a calm smile that sent chills through the studio, "since you want to lecture me about the Constitution, let's see what you really wrote in your own book." The room fell dead silent. Anderson Cooper's jaw dropped. Even the camera operators stopped moving. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. This was about to become the most brutal takedown in cable news history. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these epic political moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Mark Levin thought he could steamroll another Democrat with his decades of constitutional expertise and radio show authority. He was about to learn that some fights you just can't win, especially when your opponent has done her homework and brings receipts that could destroy your entire argument in seconds. The stage was set, the battle lines were drawn, and Jasmine Crockett was about to use Mark Levin's own words to absolutely demolish him on live television. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know exactly who these two political warriors are, and why this confrontation mattered so much. Mark Levin stands as one of conservative media's most powerful voices. At 70 years old, he's built an empire that spans decades. His radio show, The Mark Levin Show, reaches millions of Americans every single day. He's written multiple New York Times best-selling books about the Constitution, liberty, and conservative principles. His followers call him the Great One, a title that reflects his massive influence in Republican politics. Levin cut his teeth working in the Reagan administration. He's been fighting political battles since before Jasmine Crockett was even born. His expertise in constitutional law is legendary among conservatives. When Mark Levin speaks about the Constitution, millions of Americans listen and believe every word. But here's what makes Levin so formidable, and so dangerous when he's angry. He doesn't just debate. His radio show style involves shouting down opponents, overwhelming them with rapid-fire constitutional references, and using his decades of experience to make younger politicians look foolish. He's done it hundreds of times before. In fact, Levin's reputation for destroying Democrats in debates was so well established that many political operatives refused to put their candidates up against him. Just 6 months earlier, he had reduced a veteran Democratic senator to stuttering silence during a Fox News appearance about immigration policy. 3 weeks before this CNN debate, he had made a progressive law professor look completely incompetent during a discussion about Supreme Court reform. His technique was always the same: overwhelming aggression combined with encyclopedic knowledge of constitutional law. He would cite specific amendments, reference obscure court cases, and quote founding fathers with machine gun rapidity until his opponents were too flustered to respond coherently. Then he would move in for the kill, questioning their education, their intelligence, and their right to even participate in constitutional discussions. Conservative audiences loved watching Levin demolish liberal opponents. His debate clips regularly went viral in right-wing social media circles, with titles like "Mark Levin Destroys Socialist Professor" and "The Great One Obliterates Democratic Senator." These moments weren't just entertainment for conservatives. They were validation that their intellectual leaders were superior to the liberal opposition. What made Levin even more dangerous was his genuine expertise. Unlike some political commentators who relied purely on bluster, Levin actually knew constitutional law inside and out. He could cite Supreme Court cases from memory, reference specific constitutional provisions without notes, and construct complex legal arguments on the fly. This combination of real knowledge and aggressive presentation style made him nearly unbeatable in political debates. On the other side of this brewing storm sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas. At 43, she represents everything that terrifies the old guard Republican establishment. She's young, she's black, she's a woman, and she's absolutely fearless when it comes to taking on conservative legends. Crockett didn't come from political royalty. She earned her law degree, built a successful legal practice, and fought her way into Congress by beating established politicians who underestimate her. Her background as a civil rights attorney taught her something crucial. When powerful people try to intimidate you, the best defense is perfect preparation. But what makes Crockett truly dangerous is her debate style. Unlike many politicians who rely on talking points and deflection, she studies her opponents obsessively. She reads their books, watches their interviews, and memorizes their contradictions. When Jasmine Crockett walks into a debate, she doesn't just bring opinions, she brings evidence. The stakes of this particular confrontation couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just another cable news debate about policy differences. This was a clash between the old conservative establishment and the new progressive movement, between a white male radio legend and a black female congresswoman, between decades of constitutional interpretation and fresh legal scholarship. CNN had brought them together to debate voting rights legislation that was tearing Washington apart. Republicans like Levin argued the bill was unconstitutional federal overreach. Democrats like Crockett insisted it was necessary to protect democracy itself. But personal animosity had been building between these two for months. Levin had spent weeks on his radio show calling Crockett another radical Democrat who doesn't understand the Constitution. He'd mocked her legal background, questioned her intelligence, and suggested she was nothing more than a puppet for progressive donors. Crockett, meanwhile, had been quietly preparing for this moment. She knew Levin's reputation for destroying Democrats in debates. She'd watched him reduce seasoned politicians to stuttering, embarrassed silence. But she also knew something that Levin didn't realize. She'd read every single one of his books, cover to cover, and found contradictions that could completely undermine his arguments. The CNN studio that night was packed with political insiders, journalists, and activists from both sides. Everyone expected Levin to dominate. The betting odds in Washington actually favored the radio legend to destroy another Democrat, as one Republican strategist put it. Anderson Cooper, moderating the debate, had warned both participants to keep things civil. But everyone in the room could feel the tension crackling like electricity. These two didn't just disagree politically, they genuinely disliked each other. As the cameras rolled and the debate began, Levin came out swinging with his typical aggressive style. He questioned Crockett's legal credentials, challenged her understanding of constitutional principles, and used his booming radio voice to try to intimidate her into submission. For the first 10 minutes, it looked like the script was playing out exactly as everyone expected. Levin was loud, confident, and overwhelming. Crockett seemed to be struggling to get a word in edgewise. But what the audience didn't know was that Crockett was letting Levin dig his own grave. Every accusation he made, every constitutional principle he cited, every piece of legal theory he threw at her, she was mentally cataloging it all, preparing for the moment when she would turn his own expertise against him. The briefcase sitting next to her chair contained more than just notes and talking points. It contained Mark Levin's own books, carefully bookmarked and highlighted, ready to prove that the constitutional expert didn't always practice what he preached. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Mark Levin's voice started getting louder, not just passionate, genuinely angry. "Congresswoman Crockett," he barked, leaning forward in his chair, "you clearly don't understand the fundamental principles of federalism. The Constitution specifically limits federal power over state election processes. This bill you're supporting is a complete violation of the 10th Amendment." Anderson Cooper tried to maintain control. "Mr. Levin, please let the Congresswoman respond." But Levin wasn't finished. His face was turning red, the veins in his neck becoming visible as his radio show persona took over completely. "No, Anderson, I've listened to her spout progressive talking points for 10 minutes without addressing the actual constitutional issue. Someone needs to educate this woman about what the founders actually intended." Behind the cameras, CNN production assistants were frantically signaling to Anderson Cooper. The debate was supposed to be a civilized discussion about voting rights, but Levin's aggressive tone was turning it into something much more dramatic. Social media was already lighting up with clips of his outburst, and the network executives watching from the control room knew they had television gold on their hands. What they didn't know was that this was exactly what Jasmine Crockett had been hoping for. She had studied Levin's debate style obsessively, watching dozens of his previous television appearances. She knew that when he got angry, he became reckless. When he became reckless, he made mistakes. And when Mark Levin made mistakes, He gave his opponents opportunities to strike back harder than anyone expected. Crockett's legal background had taught her that the best courtroom victories came when you let your opponent think they were winning right up until the moment you destroyed them. She had spent weeks preparing for this exact scenario, Levin getting overconfident, attacking her credibility, and walking straight into the trap she had carefully constructed using his own published words. The studio audience gasped, even by cable news standards. Calling a sitting congresswoman this woman in such a dismissive tone was shocking. Several people in the audience started murmuring among themselves. Crockett's expression remained perfectly calm, but her eyes flashed with something that made the camera operators zoom in closer. She wasn't intimidated, she was waiting. "Mr. Levin," she said quietly, "I appreciate your passion for constitutional law, but perhaps we should discuss what the Constitution actually says rather than what you think it says." That's when Levin completely lost it. "What I think it says," he exploded, standing up from his chair. "Lady, I've been studying constitutional law since before you were born. I worked in the Reagan administration. I've written 5 best-selling books about constitutional principles. Don't you dare lecture me about what the Constitution says." The studio fell silent except for the sound of Levin's heavy breathing. Anderson Cooper looked genuinely concerned about maintaining order. Security guards near the edges of the studio stepped slightly closer, but Crockett just smiled, that same calm smile that had unnerved everyone earlier. 5 books, she repeated slowly, as if she was memorizing the number. "That's impressive, Mr. Levin. I've actually read them all." Levin's confidence returned immediately. "Good. Then you should understand why this voting rights bill is completely unconstitutional." "Oh, I understand your current position perfectly," Crockett replied, her voice still maddeningly calm. "What I'm curious about is how you reconcile that position with some of your previous writings." For the first time since the debate started, uncertainty flickered across Levin's face. "What are you talking about?" "Well," Crockett said, reaching toward her briefcase, "since you mentioned your books, perhaps we should discuss what you actually wrote in them." The camera caught Levin's eyes darting toward her briefcase, then back to her face. Something in his expression changed. The supreme confidence was cracking just slightly. "I stand by everything I've written," he said, but his voice had lost some of its thunder. "I'm sure you do," Crockett nodded. "That's exactly what makes this so interesting." She opened her briefcase slowly, deliberately, like a lawyer presenting evidence to a jury. The camera operators instinctively focused on her hands as she pulled out a familiar book cover. It was Levin's 2013 bestseller Liberty and Tyranny, a conservative manifesto. But this wasn't a pristine copy from a bookstore. This book was worn, highlighted, bookmarked with dozens of small tabs sticking out from the pages. Levin's face went white. "Congresswoman," Anderson Cooper interjected, "what exactly are you doing?" "Well, Anderson," Crockett said, never taking her eyes off Levin, "Mr. Levin has spent the last 15 minutes lecturing me about constitutional principle. He's questioned my education, my intelligence, and my understanding of federal law. He cited his books as evidence of his expertise." She held up the book so the camera could get a clear shot of the cover. "So I thought it might be educational for everyone to hear what Mr. Levin actually wrote about federal oversight of voting rights. Specifically, what he wrote in 2013 when a Republican was in the White House." The color drained completely from Levin's face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You see," Crockett continued, flipping to a bookmarked page, "I've done something that apparently no one else has bothered to do. I've actually read Mr. Levin's books carefully. All of them. And I've found some very interesting contradictions." Levin tried to regain control. "Congresswoman, you're taking things out of context." "Am I?" Crockett interrupted, her voice sharp for the first time. "Let's find out." She opened the book to a highlighted passage, and began reading in a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire studio. "The federal government has not only the right, but the obligation to ensure that all citizens have equal access to the voting process. State governments that implement discriminatory practices must be held accountable by federal oversight, as this represents the very foundation of our democratic republic." The silence that followed was deafening. Levin's mouth was hanging open. Anderson Cooper was staring at the book in disbelief. Even the camera operators seemed frozen. "That," Crockett said, closing the book with a snap, "is a direct quote from page 20. The same federal oversight you just spent 20 minutes calling unconstitutional." Levin's hands were visibly shaking now. That's completely different circumstances." "Is it?" Crockett reached into her briefcase again and pulled out another book. Because I have more. What happened next will go down as one of the most brutal political takedowns in cable news history. Jasmine Crockett didn't just have one book, she had all 5 of Mark Levin's bestsellers, each one meticulously studied, highlighted, and bookmarked with devastating precision. As she laid them out on the debate table like a lawyer presenting evidence, Levin's face went from red to white to green. The visual impact was stunning. The camera operators, recognizing the dramatic moment unfolding, instinctively zoomed in on the books spread across the table. Each cover was instantly recognizable to political junkies. These weren't obscure academic texts, but mainstream conservative bestsellers that millions of Americans owned and trusted. The sight of them being used as weapons against their own author created a cognitive dissonance that even viewers at home could feel through their television screens. Anderson Cooper, a veteran of thousands of political interviews, later admitted he had never seen anything quite like the methodical way Crockett arranged her evidence. It was like watching a prosecutor lay out exhibits in a murder trial, he said in a later interview. You could feel the entire energy of the room shift from a political debate to something much more serious, an interrogation. Miss Levin, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the authority of a prosecutor, addressing a jury, you've built your entire career on the idea that you're a constitutional expert. Your radio show, your books, your political influence, it's all based on the premise that you understand the law better than everyone else. She picked up the second book, American Marxism, but what your millions of listeners don't know is that your positions on constitutional law change dramatically depending on which political party is in power. Levin tried to interrupt. Congresswoman, you're completely misrepresenting. Crockett cut him off, opening to another highlighted section. Let me read another quote from your own work. This one is from American Marxism, published just 3 years ago. She cleared her throat and began reading. Federal intervention in state election processes becomes necessary when state governments fail to protect the constitutional rights of all citizens. The 14th and 15th Amendments provide clear authority for such intervention, and any conservative who opposes this principle is abandoning the very foundations of constitutional law. The studio erupted. Anderson Cooper nearly fell out of his chair. Several audience members audibly gasped. Even the CNN production crew could be heard reacting behind the cameras. But Crockett wasn't finished. That quote, she said, looking directly at Levin, directly contradicts everything you've said tonight. In your own words, written just 3 years ago, you argued that federal oversight of voting rights isn't just constitutional, it's mandatory. Levin's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Sweat was visible on his forehead despite the studio's air conditioning. The circumstances were different then, he finally managed to stammer. Were they? Crockett reached for a third book. Because I have documentation of your positions going back 15 years. And the pattern is very clear. She held up Men in Black, How the Supreme Court is Destroying America from Tooth. In this book, written during the Bush administration, you argued that federal courts had the authority to overturn state election laws that violated constitutional principle. You specifically praised federal intervention in cases where states restricted voting access. She flipped to another marked page. But then in Unfreedom of the Press, published in 2019 during the Trump administration, you argued the exact opposite. Suddenly, federal oversight became tyrannical overreach. The camera zoomed in on Levin's face, capturing every expression of shock, embarrassment and growing panic. And now, Crockett continued, with a Democratic president in office, you're back to calling federal voting rights legislation unconstitutional. The only thing that's changed, Mr. Levin, is which party controls the White House. Anderson Cooper finally found his voice. Ms. Levin, how do you respond to these specific contradictions from your own published works? Levin looked like he was having a panic attack. His hands were shaking, his voice was cracking, and his usual bombastic confidence had completely evaporated. The legal landscape has changed. These are different issues, but Crockett had saved the most devastating blow for last. She pulled out the final book, Liberty and Tyranny again, but this time she opened to a different section, one marked with multiple colored tabs. Levin, she said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just won a major court case. There's one more quote I'd like to share with everyone. This one really captures the essence of who you are as a constitutional scholar. She began reading in a voice so clear and strong that every word carried across the studio. The mark of a true constitutional conservative is consistency in principle, regardless of political convenience. Those who change their interpretation of the law based on partisan advantage are not constitutional scholars, they are political hacks masquerading as experts. The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the air conditioning running. Crockett closed the book and looked directly into the camera. That quote, ladies and gentlemen, is from page 89 of Mr. Levin's own book. He wrote those words. He published, and by his own definition, his contradictory positions on voting rights prove that he is exactly what he claims to despise, a political hack masquerading as a constitutional expert. The studio exploded. Half the audience was on their feet applauding. The other half sat in stunned silence. Anderson Cooper was frantically trying to maintain order, while simultaneously looking like he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. But the most shocking moment came when the camera caught Levin's reaction. The man who had built his career on bombastic confidence, who had spent decades shouting down opponents with superior knowledge and constitutional expertise, was completely broken. His hands were trembling, his face was pale, he looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. "Mr. Levin," Anderson Cooper prompted, "would you like to respond?" For the first time in his career, Mark Levin had nothing to say. He looked at the books spread across the table, his own books, filled with his own contradictions, highlighted and bookmarked by a woman he had tried to intimidate and dismiss. He looked at Jasmine Crockett, who was sitting calmly with the satisfied expression of someone who had just executed a perfect legal strategy. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I think we should move on to other topics." But Crockett wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Actually, Mr. Levin, I think we should stay on this topic a little longer, because your millions of radio listeners deserve to know that the constitutional expert they trust has been lying to them for years." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You haven't been teaching them constitutional law, you've been teaching them partisan politics disguised as constitutional law, and the proof is sitting right here on this table, in your own words." The camera captured Levin's complete defeat. The great constitutional scholar, the radio legend, the man who had destroyed dozens of Democratic politicians in debates, had been utterly and completely demolished by a 43-year-old congresswoman who had simply done her homework. Anderson Cooper tried one more time. "Levin, do you have any response to these specific contradictions?" Levin looked up with the expression of a man who had just realized his entire career was built on a foundation of sand. "I think," he said quietly, "this debate is over." The moment Jasmine Crockett closed Mark Levin's final book, the political world exploded. Within minutes of the debate ending, social media erupted like a volcano. The hashtag Levin exposed rocketed to the top of Twitter's trending topics, followed closely by Crockett takedown and books against bullies. The clip of Crockett reading Levin's contradictory quotes started spreading across platforms faster than wildfire. Conservative Twitter was in absolute meltdown mode. For decades, Mark Levin had been untouchable, the constitutional scholar who could destroy any liberal in debate. Watching him get systematically dismantled by a Democratic congresswoman, using his own words, was like watching Superman get defeated by kryptonite. One prominent conservative commentator tweeted, "I can't believe what I just watched. Levin got completely destroyed. How did no one catch these contradictions before?" Another posted, "This is why you don't debate people who've actually read your books." Crockett came prepared for war. But the liberal side of social media was absolutely electric with celebration. Democratic activists, progressive commentators, and political junkies were sharing clips and quotes faster than the platforms could handle. Jasmine Crockett just ended Mark Levin's entire career with his own books, posted one viral tweet that got 100,000 retweets in the first hour. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is what happens when you underestimate brilliant women." Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in preparation and precision. The memes started flowing immediately. Someone created a GIF of Crockett pulling out the books with the caption, "When you've actually done the reading." Another showed Levin's shocked face with the text, "When your own words come back to haunt you." But the most devastating meme was a split-screen image. Levin shouting confidently at the beginning of the debate next to Levin, looking defeated at the end, with the caption, "Before and after meeting someone who read your books." CNN's own social media team couldn't believe the engagement numbers. The debate clip became the network's most watched political content of the year within 6 hours. Anderson Cooper tweeted, "In 20 years of journalism, I've never seen anything quite like what Jasmine Crockett just did." That was a masterclass in preparation. The mainstream media response was swift and unanimous. Every major news outlet led with the story. The Washington Post headline read, "Congresswoman uses conservative author's own books to expose his contradiction." The New York Times went with, "In stunning debate moment, lawmaker dismantles radio host with his own words." But perhaps the most damaging coverage came from Fox News, Levin's own network family. While they tried to downplay the significance, even Fox couldn't ignore what had happened. Tucker Carlson, normally one of Levin's strongest supporters, was forced to acknowledge, "Mark had a tough night. Sometimes these debates don't go the way you expect." The impact on Levin's radio show was immediate and devastating. The next morning, the Mark Levin show opened with Levin trying to explain what had happened. But his usual bombastic confidence was completely gone. His voice was subdued. His arguments defensive. "Folks," he said to his audience, "last night was taken completely out of context." Jasmine Crockett cherry-picked quotes from books written years apart under different circumstances. But even his most loyal listeners weren't buying it. The show's call-in lines were flooded with people asking why he had never mentioned these contradictions before. Some callers were angry, feeling betrayed by someone they had trusted for constitutional guidance. Others were confused, unable to reconcile the Levin they thought they knew with the man they had seen defeated on CNN. One caller summed up the mood. "Mark, I've listened to you for 15 years. You taught me that constitutional principles don't change based on politics. But that Congresswoman just proved you've been changing your positions based on who's in the White House. How do I trust anything you say now?" Levin's response was telling. "I think we should focus on current issues rather than relitigating old debates." But the damage was already done. Radio stations across the country reported significant drops in listenership for Levin's show. Several conservative podcasts that had regularly featured Levin as a guest quietly cancelled upcoming appearances. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was the opposite of devastating. It was career-defining in the best possible way. Her congressional office was flooded with interview requests from every major news outlet. Her Twitter followers increased by 200,000 in 24 hours. Democratic fundraising groups started circulating clips of the debate with donation requests, calling Crockett the future of the Democratic Party. More importantly, the debate established Crockett as a serious intellectual force in Democratic politics. She wasn't just another progressive voice. She was someone who could take on conservative intellectual giants and win through superior preparation and legal expertise. The morning after the debate, Crockett appeared on Morning Joe, where she was greeted like a conquering hero. Congresswoman Joe Scarborough said, "That was one of the most impressive debate performances I've seen in 30 years of politics. How long did you spend preparing for that moment?" Crockett's response revealed the depth of her strategy. "Joe, I've been reading Mark Levin's books for years, not because I agree with him, but because I wanted to understand how conservative constitutional arguments were. When I realized he was changing his positions based on partisan convenience, I knew I had to document it carefully." She continued, "The truth is, Mark Levin is exactly what's wrong with political discourse in America. He presents himself as a constitutional scholar, but he's really just a partisan hack who changes his interpretation of the law based on which party is in power." Last night I proved that using his own words. The legal community's response was particularly telling. Constitutional law professors from Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown began analyzing Levin's contradictions in academic papers. The American Bar Association issued a statement noting that lawyers who changed their legal arguments based on political convenience could face ethics violation. One Harvard law professor tweeted, "What Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated last night is the difference between actual constitutional scholarship and political theater, disguised as legal analysis." But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on how political debates would be conducted going forward. Crockett had essentially created a new template. Instead of relying on talking points and zingers, she had used detailed research and documentation to expose hypocrisy. Political operatives on both sides immediately began implementing Crockett protocols, comprehensive research into opponents' previous statements, writings, and positions to identify potential contradictions. Within weeks, several other Republican commentators found themselves facing similar challenges. Democratic politicians began showing up to debates with binders full of research, quotes, and documents. The era of relying purely on rhetorical skill and bombast was ending. replaced by an emphasis on preparation and factual accuracy. The conservative movement was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many of their most prominent intellectual leaders were guilty of the same partisan inconsistency they accused liberals of practicing. Several conservative publications ran soul-searching pieces about the need for intellectual honesty. The National Review published an editorial titled, "The Levin Lesson: Why Conservative Consistency Matters More Than Political Convenience." The editorial noted that Crockett's systematic takedown had exposed a broader problem within conservative media: the tendency to change constitutional interpretations based on political expedience, rather than principled analysis. Weekly Standard writers began investigating other conservative commentators, finding similar patterns of inconsistency. Rush Limbaugh's estate even faced renewed scrutiny when researchers discovered contradictory positions in his archived show. Sean Hannity found himself fielding uncomfortable questions about his own evolving positions on federal power. The ripple effects extended beyond media personalities into the halls of Congress itself. Republican lawmakers who had cited Levin's books in floor speeches suddenly found themselves defending positions that Crockett had proven were contradictory. Several GOP congressmen quietly removed references to Levin's work from their official websites. Democratic strategists, meanwhile, were frantically trying to recruit more candidates, with Crockett's combination of legal expertise and debate preparation skills. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee launched a new program called Opposition Research Boot Camp, teaching candidates how to systematically research their opponents' previous statements and writings. Political science professors began incorporating the Levin-Crockett debate into their curricula as a case study in how thorough preparation could overcome rhetorical intimidation. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government announced a new course called Advanced Political Debate Strategy. With Crockett scheduled as a guest lecturer, the debate also sparked a broader conversation about intellectual honesty in political discourse. Sunday morning political shows began implementing new fact-checking protocols, with producers researching guests' previous statements to identify potential contradictions in real time. 3 months after the debate, Mark Levin announced he was taking a sabbatical from his radio show to focus on writing and research. Industry insiders understood this as a face-saving way to step back from the spotlight until the controversy died down. Advertisers had already begun pulling sponsorships, and several radio stations had quietly moved his show to less prominent time slots. Behind the scenes, Levin's team was frantically trying to scrub contradictory statements from his older books and radio transcripts, but the damage was already done. Every position he took was now scrutinized for consistency with his previous statements, making it virtually impossible for him to maintain credibility as a constitutional scholar. But for Jasmine Crockett, the debate became the launching pad for national prominence. She was invited to speak at law schools about political debate preparation. Her book about constitutional law and political accountability became a bestseller. Democratic leaders began talking about her as potential presidential material. The publishing world took immediate notice of Crockett's methodical approach to exposing political hypocrisy. Within weeks of the debate, she received multiple 7-figure book deal offers from major publishers. Her eventual book, Receipts: How to Hold Politicians Accountable Using Their Own Words, became an instant bestseller and spawned an entire genre of political accountability literature. Television networks began developing new formats, specifically designed to capitalize on the type of confrontation Crockett had engineered. CNN announced a new show called The Research Desk, where political figures would be challenged with their own previous statements. MSNBC launched Fact vs. Fiction, featuring detailed investigations into political contradictions. Even Fox News, trying to maintain relevance, created the Accountability Hour, though they struggled to find hosts willing to challenge conservative figures as aggressively as Crockett had challenged Levin. Legal experts began calling the Crockett technique forensic political debate, the systematic use of documented evidence to expose logical inconsistencies in opponents' position. Law schools started offering courses on this approach, and political consulting firms began hiring teams of researchers, specifically to implement Crockett protocols for their clients. The debate also transformed how political opposition research was conducted. Previously, Oppo research focused mainly on scandals, personal failures, and embarrassing moments. After Crockett's success, researchers began systematically cataloging every public statement, book passage, and interview quote from political figures, creating massive databases designed to identify contradictions that could be weaponized in future debate. Young Democratic politicians across the country began emulating Crockett's style. Primary debates started featuring candidates pulling out printed materials mid-argument, leading to what political commentators dubbed the paperwork primary. The visual of politicians armed with research binders became so common that Saturday Night Live created a recurring sketch called Homework Wars, mocking the trend. Most importantly, she had proven that intellectual preparation could defeat bombastic rhetoric, that careful research could expose political hypocrisy, and that underestimating your opponent based on their age, gender, or race was a mistake that could end careers. The international political community also took notice. British Parliament members began implementing similar tactics during Prime Minister's questions. Canadian political debates saw increased emphasis on documented contradiction. European political consultants traveled to Washington specifically to study Crockett's methods and adapt them for their own electoral systems. The debate between Mark Levin and Jasmine Crockett didn't just end one evening's television program. It marked a fundamental shift in American political discourse, proving that in the information age, the politician who does their homework will always defeat the one who relies on reputation and bluster. As Crockett said in her final interview about the debate, Mark Levin spent decades building his reputation on the idea that he was smarter than everyone else. But intelligence without integrity is just manipulation. I didn't destroy Mark Levin's career. I simply used his own words to reveal who he really was. If this story of political preparation defeating political intimidation inspired you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're bringing you the most dramatic political moments and behind-the-scenes stories that mainstream media won't tell you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next time someone gets completely exposed using their own words. The political world is full of these moments, and we'll make sure you see them all.